Welcome to Moody Reads. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in January and February. In January, I made it a goal to read at least some every day that month, and I succeeded, and it went on into part of February, so that was really exciting. And with that, I ended up finishing 5 books. I also started a few other ones as well. Of the 5 books that I did pick up, 4 of them were audio, 2 were fiction, and 3 were nonfiction. I started out the year with Icebreaker by A.L. Grizzati. This is a young adult romance about 2 hockey players who are in college hockey and are both big contenders to be the top of the draft. So naturally they hate each other. But of course, this is a YA romance, so by the end, they don't hate each other anymore. This one was really cute, and it had really good friendships throughout it. I really liked how a lot of the teammates interacted. And the actual hockey component was also interesting. I am not a sports gay. So I know very little about hockey other than it's on ice and sometimes people beat each other up. But by the end of the book, I kind of understood what was happening. So I feel like that's a personal win. After that, I listened to the audiobook of Your Brain on Art, which I mostly read because it was one of the Barnes & Noble monthly picks, and my library ended up having a copy. I was kind of interested in the premise and needed an audiobook, so I tried it out. And this one was really frustrating because the beginning was really interesting. I liked the different ways that they were looking at art. They were talking about how it was used in these different medical contexts, both in terms of like art therapy, but also like physiologically how sound can impact people. And that was all really cool. But then in the last half of the book, like we were talking about Starbucks CEO using art and creativity. It's like, why do I care? Honestly. And then the conclusion was just really like individualistic and honestly did not make sense with some of the other stuff that they talked about. So that was super disappointing. I ended up giving it 3 stars, but a lot of that is the first half of the book doing a lot of work, to be honest. So that was disappointing and is definitely the worst book that I've read so far this year, January and February. But after that, I got the audiobook of I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me by Jamison Shea. I had started this, I think in October or November of last year. I got to the halfway point and then the library needed it back, which was painful because it was a really cool story. It focuses on our main character who's in a French ballet school, and if you know anything about ballet, it is cutthroat. And she is a black girl in this ballet school, so there's like a lot of racism. She also comes from a family who's not super well off like a lot of these other people, and they've kind of abandoned her. And so she ends up making a deal with the demon basically for power so that she can actually get where she's supposed to go with the talent that she has. So it gets really intense. There's murder. There's a lot of like gory details. It's really interesting. I don't know where the sequel is going to go, but I'm interested to see. After that, I listened to Forest of Noise by Musab Abu Toha. And this is a Palestinian poetry collection that was recently released. If not in January, then maybe December. In this, he talks about Palestine, obviously. Not just the recent times, but also looking at his family experiencing the Nakba And there's even a poem that kind of looks into the future in these different ways. There were poems that talked a lot about family in general and their connection to this place. It was really well done, really beautiful. And I feel like I don't usually listen to poetry collections on audiobook, with the exception of some narrative poetry or novels in verse, rather. But I had a really good time listening to this one. And then the final book that I finished in January was Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment and Postnormal Possibilities by Nick Walker. This was an essay collection by the person that popularized the term neurodiversity and that kind of concept. She isn't the only person to have talked about it, or necessarily the first, but was definitely a big part in putting that into the public lexicon and or popular discourse. She's an academic whose stuff is quoted a lot in a lot of when people talk about this, because in part because she put a lot of her stuff out on a website for a lot of people to see. And this collection includes those original articles, as well as, in a lot of cases, her reflections on it now, things that have changed in the last decade or so since they were originally posted. There's also a section that's more memoir, talking about her experiences with other autistic people and her experiences with martial arts. I think overall this collection is pretty accessible. I would say that you should probably have a decent understanding of the social model of disability before going into this. If you don't know what that is, maybe a more introductory text and then that. But if you're already kind of familiar with that and wanting to know more about autism and kind of expanding your worldview in terms of like disability advocacy, this is a really good one. And that is all that I finished in January. It is not all that I started, though. Like I said, I did read every day. One of the things that I started was Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, which I'm still not finished with, but am really enjoying. I love this concept so much, which I think might be one of the reasons why I'm having a hard time digging into it. Sometimes, if I really, really like part of something, I'll set it down, which is totally counterintuitive. But that's also what ended up happening with the Undocumented Americans. I loved the approach that she used. I've done sociological research and taken like methods classes and stuff, and I thought a lot about that and her like perspective as a journalist. And I started it and then stopped it, put it down for a couple years, and then read it all in a day. So I hope it doesn't take me that long to sit down and just read through this because I'm enamored by the concept. But I started that. I also started The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which is very good so far, but also like a doozy emotionally, because the world and the United States specifically is what it is, and this kind of explains everything. And also I can see at least a couple of things happening now that are literally what she is describing, and she wrote this in 2008. So I'm still working through that one. I've also got a couple of other things. I think I started an astrology book, which I do want to finish, but just didn't end up touching in February. And I think I also started another audiobook, The Myth of Normal, which I've since had to return to the library. I do want to read it eventually, but I just wasn't necessarily feeling it, I don't think. And I think that might be all for the ones I started. Which brings us to February. In February, I read 8 books, and 2 of them were on audio. 2 were fiction, 3 were more standard nonfiction, and 3 were poetry collections. 2 were more personal poetry collections, and 1 was a poetry collection inspired by history, and I'll get to that later. I started out the month finishing Bellies by Nicola Dinnan on audiobook. I actually read that for a vlog, so I'll link that, or it's the book that I ended up finishing for the vlog. This book chronicles a queer relationship throughout its various stages. It says a lot about how we connect with people and what we know about each other in a lot of really interesting ways. And this is one that I definitely had criticisms for when I was reading it, but I think this was one of those cases where I liked parts of the book so much that some of the negatives ended up jumping out more, if that makes sense. But even still, I really loved this book. It kind of rocked my world, and I've been thinking about it a lot since. This is a debut novel too, so I'm really excited to see what else this author puts out. After that, I read Her by Sherry Muhanji, which I read for a different vlog. This one is a backlist lesbian novel. I'm not sure that any of the main characters focused on would identify as a lesbian, though, to be clear. The author might be, but it's like 90s sapphic literature, I think might be more accurate technically. That's neither here nor there. This focuses on relationships between a lot of different people in Detroit in the 1950s. It particularly focuses on a lot on Black women in the community. The main character is newly pregnant, newly married. I think she's 19 and is coming into this new family and meeting the matriarch, who is more strict in a lot of ways. So you're seeing kind of their relationship. This also looks a lot at agency for Black women as well. It talks a lot about trauma, and it's one that's kind of non-linear, or it's hard to really have a concept of time reading it, because sometimes different segments will happen really close to each other. Sometimes there are long breaks. There are also some that I'm convinced happen like out of order, and then there are also some things that are flashbacks. And that's definitely the kind of thing that, I don't know, some people would really not like, but I thought that it was really interesting. This is one that I feel like deserves to be like taught in a class. Like, I feel like it could be dissected in a lot of different ways. I'm gonna stop talking just because I don't want to meander too far, but it was really, really interesting. I enjoyed it, and it's another one that I've just thought about a lot. I had a lot of really good books this month that were like that, though. If it is one that you think that you might like or want to pick up, you should probably check out the content warnings, though. Just because, like I said, it talks about trauma, so there are different things that happen. I usually keep stuff like that on my story graph. After that, I read a book with another pronoun in the title, She by Minnie Bruce Pratt. I read both she and her in the same video, so you can see maybe more of my thoughts as I was reading it, but this one was fantastic. It's tied for my favorite book in February. This is a memoir by Minnie Bruce Pratt, who was the partner of Leslie Feinberg, who wrote the classic Stone Butch Blues, as well as a lot of really amazing essays and other books that you should definitely read if you haven't. But this memoir was really interesting. It was written in a series of vignettes. Like, I don't think that any of the chapter sections, other than the introduction, were longer than like 4 pages. You get to see parts of her life as she's growing up, in a southern white town. She gets married to a man and then later comes out as a lesbian, and deals with things like having her children taken away from her. But a lot of this focuses on her love life, so you get lots of snippets of that. You also get little bits about her activism too, and her teaching gender studies. And one of the big themes throughout this is also in regards to gender. Like, she's reflecting on her own gender and some of the things that she parsed through, particularly being a femme lesbian. So you're reading all of this, and then when you get to the point where she's meeting Leslie, it switches from her talking about all these different people, not really by name, really hardly anyone she calls by name, I think. But it's mostly her referring to, she did this, he did that, whatever. But when Leslie starts into the picture, it's to you. So she's basically written this book to Leslie. And a lot of the themes, other than the love and relationships, there's a lot about solidarity woven in through this, particularly looking at the experience of trans people. Like I said, she reflects a lot on her gender, and there's a passage towards the end of this where they attend the Women's Festival, which the year prior had thrown out a trans woman for not being, it was like a woman-born woman was like their stipulation. But they end up going in and basically being with a group of trans people and kind of marching through it. And she kind of meditates a lot throughout this section, which I think is longer than some of the others. But that was just a lot of the stuff that she says about solidarity and connecting with these different people through that is really cool. There's also, race isn't like the main focus of this, it is very salient throughout a lot of it. And so I think that her like anti-racist work and her kind of like emphasis on that really shows in through there. So it was just really excellent. And I also think it's funny, I was thinking about this a while after I read it, because this is another one that I've thought about a lot since I read it. This one said a lot, and it was beautifully written. I loved it a ton, but I also feel like we didn't get a very clear picture of who Minnie Bruce Pratt was. I don't think that that's what it set out to do either, so that isn't a criticism, it's just a fact. And between that and how sensual some of the book is, I was thinking, like, what Scorpio placement does she have? Because those two things together, there's no way. Lo and behold, she's a Scorpio Venus, Virgo Sun, which totally makes sense. But anyways, I just thought that was very funny, and fitting. And I will say with this one, it was really hard to find for a while, but Sinister Wisdom Press recently re-released it, so I definitely recommend getting that. The copy that I have is one of the older ones, and the newer one has a really cool cover. So if you did want to read it, you don't have to wait until there's one that's reasonably priced on thrift books, like I did. After that, I read Women's Liberation and the African Freedom Struggle by Thomas Sankara, which includes 2 speeches by Thomas Sankara and an introduction that tells you more about who Thomas Sankara was and fills you in a little bit on the country of Burkina Faso in that revolution. He was one of the leaders who led the revolution of what was formerly known as Upper Volta, that was a former French colony. Throughout this book, you get to hear about some of the things that the country was able to do. Some of the things that stuck out to me were things like the medical advances, bringing um, maternal mortality down a considerable amount in such a short amount of time, and efforts to increase education. And throughout these speeches that he gave, he was talking specifically about the women's role in the revolution, both talking about what women had done up until that point, but also what needs to be done more for women, and why women's emancipation is key in continuing to have a society that is like good for everyone. Women's liberation is key to liberation at large. And these were from the 1980s. I think these speeches were from 1983 and 1987 or something like that. So they do have some pitfalls that I think are pretty par for the course, even in like larger feminist spaces. I think that it's obviously very like straight focused, and they say some things about sex work that I'm sure people more qualified than I am to really speak on that would take issue with. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find like any guy in the 1980s saying anything approaching this, much less someone who is like a president or a leader in any sort of capacity. He had a lot of really sharp insight, I think, on why women's liberation is key, and what that really looks like. Because he specifically says that he's not talking about just letting women do exactly what men do. It's about kind of reframing our understanding of man and woman and how they relate to each other. So it was really interesting, and it was very cool to see, especially because that's not a place that I've certainly ever learned about in a history classroom. And while their revolution was short-lived, it was really successful in the short time that it was that they were doing things kind of in that way. And anyways, it was a very good book, very enlightening, and has a lot of insight that people could still benefit from today. After that, I listened to The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is a newer release that's part travel writing and part cultural criticism with a little bit of history. In this, Ta-Nehisi Coates visits several different places, and throughout it is sort of talking about the power of a story. He starts out with an introduction talking about the first time he read a piece of journalism that really shook him to his core. That sort of sets the scene. Then we hear about his first trip to Africa, and as he's talking about that, he's talking about the framing historically of Egypt as a non-black country and why that is important, and why there were some people who were so insistent upon Egypt being different than the rest of Africa, and talking about racism in these different ways, scientific racism that's tied to this. So again, kind of the power of the story in how it shapes how we understand other people. He also talks about book banning in another chapter where he visits Carolina, I think South Carolina, and then and also talks about his assumptions of some of the people there, and ends with his trip to Palestine, and goes into detail about how he saw these different places, especially having multiple people act as sort of tour guides or not having a tour guide in some places. Talks about the history of some places, what things are named after, and also how his kind of understanding of it has changed or developed especially since he had used, I think, Israel in one of his earlier writings, in a way that he doesn't agree with anymore. So there were a lot of really strong sections where the writing was really impactful and really beautiful. And I think some of his explorations of certain historical topics were really interesting, like when he was talking about scientific racism and some of the sections of Palestine. But it was unfortunate that while there were these really strong sections, again, I think it made the sections that were lacking even more obvious. The strongest chapter was definitely the last part, like chapter 4 or part 4. Whereas I think he could have gone in more, particularly on the chapter about South Carolina. I also think that while he does talk a lot about certain historical things throughout, there are also certain points where he will mention something and not go into detail at all, in a way that's kind of odd, especially when he does go on these rabbit trails for some things. Now, obviously, there's a limit to what you can do, but since it's already kind of short, it just seems like there could have been more in that regard. And I also thought that there were some areas where his very flowery writing kind of went overboard. Like I said, there were parts of it where I really loved the writing, like it was really impactful and cool. But then there were some areas where he would try to do the same thing and like keep going in a way that was kind of pretentious and unappealing. So in that way, I think that this probably would have benefited from like cooking a little longer, you know? It just seemed like there were sections that were super, super strong and then sections that were more weak. Overall, I am definitely glad that I read it and I would recommend it. I think that it's a good that it will be a good entrance for a lot of people, particularly to hear about Palestine, because that was the longest chapter, if I'm not mistaken. And he is a very popular author. And so I think that's a good starting point. This should definitely not be your, ending point. So I have criticisms, but overall it was good. And then after that, I read 3 poetry books in pretty quick succession. And I talk about all of these in an upcoming vlog. So if you want to hear more about them, that's the place to go. All of these were excellent. They were 5-star reads. And all of these were not only really well written, they were also very well curated. Like, I think that in poetry collections, sometimes they can feel meandering, like there's not something connecting them. And all 3 of these had a really strong connecting point or multiple connecting points. And they had very few poems that felt like space fillers. So the first one was Content Warning Everything by Quick and Mezzy. I'm somehow so behind on Quick and Mezzy books. I adored their first 3 and just need to catch up. So I am so glad that I finally read this one. My favorite poems in this one were probably the ones with the religious motifs, where they're talking about certain Bible characters as like if they were a part of their family or something like that. I thought that was very strong, as well as the self-portrait poems. A Fortune for Your Disaster by Hanifa Durakib. This was really excellent. A lot of these were focused around grieving, and there are a lot of pop culture references. And then 1919 by Eve Ewing, which is what is tied with the Minnie Proust Pratt book as my favorite book of the month. This collection is inspired by the 1919 Chicago race riots, and in the beginning of each poem, you see the part of the document that inspired the poem. Eve Ewing was researching these riots for a book, and the document in question is something from just a couple years later, kind of breaking down the race riots. So in that way, some of the poems are talking about the event itself. And then also we can, I think it kind of speaks on like how it was presented as well. The first section talks about before, so what led up to it, during the actual riots, and then after, which features different things that would happen in Chicago afterwards, but also like visions of the future. It was just really incredible. This is one where I adored the concept, and then the execution was just phenomenal. So it was really great, and I am super stoked because I also I recently got Original Sins by this author, and it makes me so excited to read some of her like traditional nonfiction, especially seeing kind of the eye that she has for like reflecting on the history in this way. So that's what I read in January and February. A lot of nonfiction, a lot of audiobooks. Another thing to talk about in terms of reading that I almost completely forgot. I've been doing a couple of things to track my reading outside of Storygraph and all that. I've got a crochet project and a book journal. My crochet project is a snake book tracker that I talk about putting together a couple of videos ago. So this is what we have so far. I still haven't found the buttons to give it eyes. But yeah, it's been going pretty well. I've ended up doing the star stitch for the YA books, which I think is fine with the stuffing. I think I originally tried to do maybe like a bean stitch or something like that, and it was just not going to work out. It was a little too holy. I don't love that it looks bigger than the other stitch, which could have been expected, I think, but I still think it's cool, and it's good to be getting used to doing other sorts of stitches anyways. So that's the book Snake. My reading journal, I won't flip through the whole thing just because there's a lot of writing in parts of it. Just as a forewarning, I'm not an artist. This isn't gonna look super pretty, but I had a lot of fun doing it. I am not doing the exact same thing each month. I'm kind of trying to work out how I want to track things best, so I am tweaking each month a little bit. So we've got the beginning of January. I added this book haul thing actually at the end, and this was just where I had space for it. My to be read list, along with the readathon that it's for, which I found convoluted and did not do in February. I only did just the TBR. And then we had this, which is to track if I'm reading or writing. If I only read, it's in a red color. If I only wrote, it's in a blue color, which I don't think we really had much of that in February. There's a little bit of blue here, but like, I think I did the wrong thing, so I just had red and blue in a day. Lots of purple, which is a combination of red and blue, and then I put brown places that I did videos, and I'm excluding vlogging footage. Like if I only like vlog and like no editing or putting together whole videos. I don't know if that really makes sense, but that's what I did. And then I was trying to keep track of kind of when I read or wrote, and so you have one column that's when I was working, one column when I wasn't. And clearly the theme for January was hot drinks. And then on this page, I had the kind of writing that I was doing. I wanted to see what kind. Whenever I put up a post, I have a space for that. If I had finished any complete writing project, I would have put it there, but I didn't. So that's a goal that I haven't really achieved. I wanted to do at least one full essay a month, like citations and all that, a first draft, a second draft at least. That didn't happen either month, but that's okay. And then the final page I'll show of this is my kind of complete reading. So I have all the books that I finished here, books I was in the middle of reading, and then the academic articles that I read are in this little paper. And then we have February, which I think got a little bit cuter with their reading goals. And I did meet all of those, although 2 of the books is kind of like on a technicality. I have those kind of little DIY class things that I put together, and while I didn't read something that was on the list, it felt very related to the class, and I don't know. I used it. It's fine. And then I have my pile of possibilities, or TBR. And then February's theme was pastries. The same color combo, red or pink, is just reading, blue is just writing, purple is both, and if it has brown in it, I also worked on a video. And you can see that I had a couple of days that I didn't read or write. At least on one of them I worked on a video. But I am reading, I'm still pretty consistent, which is nice. And then I'm still tracking the different things that I'm writing and when I'm reading. But the difference between this month and last month is that last month, in January, I just put whether or not I did it. And I also wasn't tracking reading this way. In February, I also included reading and when I did said thing, because I didn't have one of these sections. So I just kind of condensed more or less. Then I have my section here with the social media and the books that I read, the books I worked on, and the one lone academic journal that I read in February. I did download a bunch though, so they're available for me to look at. So that is my completed spread for January and February. And then I'll give you a peek at March's to see what else I've kind of tweaked since then. I liked the goals are similar to how I had them laid out in February, and same with the TBR. But the Trans Rights Readathon is happening in March, so I have a whole page for that. I have, whenever I complete one, I'll put it in here. And then this is my kind of tentative pile of possibilities that I have, which I guess I need to give it a little header there. And then March tracker is floral. I have, what is today? Today's like the 6th or something. So I need to fill this out. But I've decided to do that. I kept with the style of tracker like in February, where I'm looking at the time as well. These pages look kind of weird when they're like barren like this, but I've changed up how I want to do the social media posts. I've got one thing, and I'm going to put which app it was for. So this has the little Instagram thing in there, so that was an Instagram post that I did. I'm also behind in filling this out, so I think I've done a book review, so I would have the book review with the little storygraph insignia, and then another Instagram post, so I would have that with a little Instagram thing. So I think this looks cuter, consolidated, and then I'll maybe have something written this month and I can figure out how I want to do that, because that's not going to be put in here unless it were like a blog post, which I could do. I technically have a blog, but it's often neglected. Um, and anyways, that is a little sneak peek at March as well, in terms of what I think my reading's gonna look like over the next little bit. Um, it's kind of hard to tell. I've sort of stopped doing more official TBRs and just kind of keep it to myself because it hardly ever ends up panning out, but that's fine. I do anticipate being pretty nonfiction heavy still. I think that I'm gonna end up with a healthy mix of backlist and frontlist titles because I have a lot of books, both fiction and nonfiction, from the 90s and before, that I'd really like to get into, especially people who write both fiction and nonfiction. However, I have some recent or upcoming releases that I'm super excited about. Like I said, Original Sins, I'm super excited to read at this point. But there's also a lot coming out this month. John Green's newest book about tuberculosis comes out, and I'll probably read that pretty shortly after it comes out. The new Hunger Games book is coming out, and I'm really excited about it. I did not read Songbirds and Snakes because I refuse to read something that focuses on President Snow. Um, but I do want to reread The Hunger Games. That's something that is close to the top of my list to do, and so that I can read the newest one, which is going to be about Haymitch. So those are just some little thoughts on where my reading might go. I have so many things laid out as possibilities, and so we'll see what happens. I'll probably be vlogging a fair amount just because that's been really fun and comfy and kind of helps me read more, I think, and I'm less likely to like doom scroll and see what new horrors keep popping up every day. But yeah, I think that's about it for what I have here. Be sure to let me know if you've read any of these or are planning on reading any of them. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.